I'm interfering by being there, in which case...
That'll work. That might work for two people.
Yeah, oh yeah, it'll work. I just don't want it, I don't want you to feel like you're falling off the edge all the time.
Don't worry about that.
All right, let's go. Let's come on now.
Okay.
I'll let you get in first. Okay. Sit down. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Philip Hyman. I'm a professor at the Kennedy School and at Harvard Law School. And as you shall shortly hear, I ran a very sizable project in Guatemala for about 3 years. That makes me the moderator. To your left and my right on the panel is first Manuel Conde, head of the Guatemalan Peace Commission, then General Garcia, Minister of Defense of Guatemala. Then, on my immediate right, Bernardo Neumann, head of the Guatemalan President's Commission on Human Rights, a presidential commission. To my left, Mr. John Hamilton, who is the Office Director for Central American Affairs at our Department of State. To his left, Jennifer Shermer, professor at Wellesley College, and then, hardly visible to me, my friend Anne Manuel of America's Watch. What we are going to do, the way we're going to proceed is this. I'll give a short introduction trying to set the stage for the questions that will be discussed. Then a panel of the 3 Guatemalan visitors and very distinguished officials on my right will present their comments on the questions raised by the title and by my introduction. And the primary speaker for the Guatemalan panel will be Mr. Conde, head of the Guatemalan Peace Commission. After the panel speaks, Mr. Hamilton will speak. Again, he is representative of the State Department. After him, Jennifer Shermer, and then finally, Anne Manuel. We will try and keep the statements short enough that there should be a good period of question and answer at the end. I'll target ending the session at 9:30. So let's begin. Since we're starting a little bit late, I may target a little bit later than that, but not too much. The USAID funded a project of Harvard Law School at my request to work with the criminal justice system of Guatemala, particularly with the courts. And that was something that I did through Harvard Law School with a crew of about 7, 8, 10 people over the years from 1987 to 1990. We loved working in Guatemala. We were very happy. We liked working with the courts. But we finally left when, in August 1989, 12 students were disappeared from the large Guatemalan state university, San Carlos. Nobody of those 12, I believe about 6 were found dead. Some short time thereafter, I don't know that the other 6 have ever been found one way or the other. That case has never been solved. I felt at the time that nothing was being done about it. I bring this up not to give my own personal history, but to give a little bit of recent history that mixes me and Guatemala. I felt that nothing was being done to examine the deaths and the possible governmental involvement, never proved one way or the other, in the deaths of those 12 students. And so at that time, under a previous administration, that of President Cerezo, I went first to an earlier Minister of Defense, and then to the Minister of Interior, called the Minister of Government in Guatemala, and then to President Cerezo, saying to each of them that we would leave Guatemala and would not work there if there was no serious effort to solve those crimes, to solve the case of the students. There were other cases too, but that one was very dramatic and very close to home for a university. When nothing was done, we left, with very much to our regret. We left in 1990. It's now March 1993. And in many ways, the question for the panel, and the question that I'm sure our Guatemalan visitors will want to address, is how has the situation evolved? What is different? What's the same? What problems have changed, which haven't? Let me relate that before closing to the subject that was listed for today's talk. Peace, human rights, military-civilian relations. The biggest single issue is the fact that what stands between Guatemala and a far brighter future is only 2 things, or appears to be only 2 things to many people outside Guatemala. The absence of peace and the continued reputation of the Guatemalan government, I'm not judging correct or incorrect, as repressive and often brutal. And those 2 things seem to be anachronisms. They seem to be left over in a world from which the Cold War has disappeared. They seem even to be strange in embattled Central America. They seem especially to be strange when one thinks that the number of guerrillas, maybe General Garcia will talk about that, the number of guerrillas is probably 500 or 1,000, and there are 50 to 100 security forces for each one of those. The two are related, and in the title of this evening's presentation, the two, peace, maybe the three, civil-military relations, and human rights are related. The reason is obvious. Peace depends on a credible promise to the relatively small guerrilla movement of two things: an end to prevent repressive violence and threats, and an end to impunity, because without that, it won't be safe for any dissenting group to make peace. And I should say the guerrillas are equally, if not equally, the guerrillas are also responsible for human rights violations. And second, civilian control, a sense that the country is a country run by civilians and not by the army. Those are the two things that stand between Guatemala and peace, with the end of a Cold War where the United States made it difficult to make peace. But both of these things are thought to be in doubt, and that's why, and with these words I want to introduce the Guatemalan panel and invite them to, if they can, address this. A barrage of human rights reports have come out in the last 2 or 3 months. Each of them is very critical of Guatemala. Each says that fewer are killed, fewer are disappeared, fewer are tortured, but that the numbers are still large, and that impunity, the absence of any charges brought against anybody at a high level, there have been some low-level charges, is still very much the general rule. When I say that, I'm not just talking about American human rights groups, I'm talking about the UN Human Rights Commission, I'm talking about the United States State Department report, which perhaps Mr. Hamilton will mention, a variety of reports, the report of the Human Rights Ombudsman in Guatemala, all very critical of continued repression. And second of all, there is continued concern, and I hope this will be the other subject addressed, that the military is not under civilian control. That sometimes, if I may, even General Garcia will speak up and answer for the government before the president will answer. So these are the two problems that people on the outside worry about. And with that, I turn to Mr. Conde and invite you, Mr. Conde, to kick us off.
Muy buenas noches a todos los asistentes. Presento el saludo del pueblo y gobierno de Guatemala esta noche con nuestra presencia en esta importante universidad.
Good evening, everybody, and I want to convey to you the regards from the Guatemalan people to you and to this university.
Valoramos como muy importante nuestra presencia esta noche porque sabemos del interés que hay en Harvard sobre la situación de Guatemala.
We value the presence of each one of you here tonight because we understand there is quite a lot of interest in this university about the situation in Guatemala.
Y luego de escuchar los conceptos de la persona que me ha antecedido en el uso de la palabra, creo que es muy importante nuestra presencia esta noche.
And given the comments that were pronounced just before me, I think it is very important that our presence here does take place.
Muchas veces la opinión o el criterio que se tenga de un país y de su sociedad desde lejos puede ser totalmente diferente o puede ser tergiversado por la información que ustedes puedan manejar.
The perception of a society from the outside sometimes tends to be a little bit distorted.
Pero esta noche no vengo a hacer una defensa oficiosa de mi país.
Tonight I'm not coming here to defend vigorously the position of my country.
Vengo a contarles a ustedes los esfuerzos que estamos haciendo los guatemaltecos para resolver los problemas que por tantos años nos han dañado.
I'm coming here to convey to you, to explain to you the many efforts that are underway to solve all the problems that have afflicted the Guatemalan society.
En una universidad como esta, no podemos hablar publicitariamente y no podemos hablar con el ánimo de causar una impresión personal a las personas.
it would be unfair for us to speak here with an emphasis on publicity or causing an impression. That is not our intention tonight.
Ante un auditorio como ustedes, tengo que hablar de las cosas de fondo, de las cosas que realmente tienen que resolverse dentro del marco democrático.
I would like to concentrate on the fundamental things, on things that lie within the democratic frame of reference.
Sería un tremendo error pretender corregir la situación de los derechos humanos con una mano dura o tal vez con represión.
It would be wrong to try to correct the human rights situations with a strong hand and with an atmosphere and acts of repression.
Pero la situación de los derechos humanos sí puede resolverse con una mano firme y fortaleciendo las instancias democráticas.
However, the human rights situation can be resolved with a strong hand within the democratic framework.
Pero para ello necesito narrarles a ustedes un poco de la historia de nuestros últimos 32 años.
In order to do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the background in the last 32 days and 32 years.
Han sido 32 años de mucho dolor para nuestro país.
These 32 years have been very painful for our country.
Quiero contarles una anécdota personal.
I'd like to tell you, to share with you a personal anecdote.
En 1960, cuando yo tenía apenas 3 años,
When I was 3 years old, in 1960,
mi padre era un congresista
my father was a member of Congress,
y fue asesinado por la intolerancia política de mi país.
and he was a victim, he was assassinated by the political intolerance in my country.
6 años después, mi abuelo era el presidente del Congreso de Guatemala
6 years later, my grandfather was the president of the Congress of Guatemala,
y la guerrilla lo asesinó también en mi país.
and he was also assassinated by the guerrilla.
Difícilmente hay una familia que no pueda hablar de dolor y de sufrimiento en el seno de ella.
You could be hard-pressed to find a family that has suffered more than my family.
Y por eso los guatemaltecos queremos resolver ese problema, pero en el fondo no lo queremos resolver superficialmente.
That's why we Guatemalans want to solve this problem fundamentally and not on the surface.
Y por ello es que cuando el presidente Serrano plantea la iniciativa de paz total para la nación, no hay un solo guatemalteco que no comparta ese sentimiento.
And that's why when President Serrano lays out the focus of the peace effort, there isn't one Guatemalan citizen that doesn't agree wholeheartedly with his efforts.
Cuando yo escuchaba las palabras de mi antecesor, yo escuchaba que él hablaba de los estudiantes desaparecidos y de las personas que han sido afectadas por esta situación.
The speaker before me made reference to the disappeared students.
Pero quiero decirles que en mi país no solo han sufrido los estudiantes y los miembros de las clases populares, hemos sufrido todos los sectores de nuestra sociedad.
Every sector of our society, every sphere of our society has suffered, not only students and not only the middle class.
No ha habido un empresario, ni ha habido una ama de casa o un maestro universitario que haya estado ajeno de ese dolor.
Everybody has suffered, including industrialists, amas de casa?
Empresario o un maestro universitario.
Industrialists, people in academia, homemakers.
Pero, ¿cuál es el motivo de la confrontación de nuestro país? Nos preguntamos nosotros mismos los guatemaltecos.
But what is the reason for this confrontation we Guatemalans ask ourselves?
¿Cómo surgen los grupos insurgentes? Es otra pregunta que nos hemos hecho.
What are the conditions that give rise to the insurgency that we ask ourselves?
Y quiero decirles esta noche que la guerrilla en mi país no surge como respuesta a la necesidad de la sociedad.
The guerrilla in our country has not come out as a consequence of the conditions in society.
La guerrilla surge en mi país como consecuencia de la coyuntura histórica de los años 60, cuando Castro llega al poder en Cuba.
The cause that gave rise to the guerrilla in my country was in the 60s, the advent of Castro's influence in Central America.
Los primeros líderes guerrilleros eran miembros del ejército de Guatemala.
The first leaders of the Guatemalan insurgency were members of the Cuban military?
Sí, del ejército.
Of the Guatemalan military.
Ahora, ¿qué situación nos puso a nosotros en una polarización más fuerte?
What put us in a situation of being so polarized?
Y con toda franqueza quiero decirles, Guatemala prestó su territorio para que se preparara la invasión de Bahía Cochinos.
And I have to tell you, frankly, that Guatemala lent part of its territory to prepare the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Y esa situación nos puso entre ceja y ceja de Fidel Castro y por eso su exportación de sabotaje y terrorismo fue directamente a nuestro país.
And that's precisely what put us in the eyes of Fidel Castro in our country.
No podía dejar de mencionar estas cosas, pero quiero decirles que los guatemaltecos el día de hoy abrazamos con confianza nuestra esperanza de que pronto llegará la paz.
We Guatemalans embrace the hope that very soon peace will arrive in our country.
El presidente Jorge Serrano ha planteado una iniciativa de paz total para la nación.
The initiative of President Serrano is an initiative of total peace for the country,
Tiene 4 puntos fundamentales.
and it consists of 4 fundamental points.
El primero de ellos es terminar la lucha armada de más de 32 años.
The first one is to bring an end to the armed conflict.
Luego, el logro de una equidad económica y social.
Second, achieving better equity, better economic equity in the country.
El tercero es el fortalecimiento del régimen de legalidad.
The third is strengthening the legal basis in our country.
Y el cuarto es la profundización y la consolidación del sistema democrático.
And fourth and final,
Es el fortalecimiento del régimen
the
democrático.
strengthening of the democratic way of life.
Es muy difícil hablarles en 10 minutos de los esfuerzos que estamos haciendo en esos 4 renglones.
It is very difficult to summarize in just 10 minutes what we're doing in all those 4 points.
Me encantaría tener más tiempo para hablar con ustedes de lo que estamos haciendo,
I would love to have more time to discuss this at greater length.
pero quiero decirles esta noche que no ha habido un guatemalteco de los que estamos en la vida legal y en la vida pública que no estemos comprometidos en este proyecto.
But I have to tell you that there isn't one Guatemalan that is not directly involved in this project, in this process.
Y tal vez ustedes se preguntarán si el ejército de Guatemala participa también de ese proyecto.
And you're probably asking yourselves if the army in Guatemala is also participating in this process.
Y quiero decirles con toda confianza y con toda seguridad que sí está participando el ejército de Guatemala como institución de gobierno en el proceso de paz.
I have to tell you resolutely that the army is participating very positively in the process.
Ha sido el ejército quien ha llevado una posición de vanguardia en este esfuerzo por la paz de Guatemala.
The effort, in fact, has been spearheaded by the army.
Su compromiso ha sido genuino y tenemos en nuestra comisión de paz a 5 militares de alto rango integrando esta comisión.
Its commitment is genuine, and there are 5 members of the military in our commission, in the Peace Commission.
Y estamos negociando con la guerrilla guatemalteca sentándonos a la misma mesa,
We are negotiating with guerrilla members at the same table,
reconociendo que ellos son guatemaltecos y que tienen derecho a vivir en nuestro país, pero dentro del marco de la legalidad.
recognizing that they are like ourselves, Guatemalans, and they have the right to live in a democratic country in Guatemala like us.
Les hemos dicho que queremos verlos en el trabajo político, pero dentro del marco democrático.
We have told them that we want to see them active in the political sphere, but within the democratic bounds.
Y confiamos en Dios en que pronto llegará ese momento en que todos podamos abrazarnos como hermanos en Guatemala.
And we hope that the moment will arrive soon when we'll all be able to embrace each other as brothers in Guatemala.
El presidente Serrano ha hecho una propuesta de 90 días para la firma de la paz.
President Serrano's proposal is to sign a peace agreement in 90 days.
La guerrilla todavía no ha respondido afirmativamente a esa propuesta, pero esperamos que la próxima semana, a partir del día 10, podamos negociar ese punto con la guerrilla.
We're still awaiting the response from the guerrilla. We're hoping that next month,
La próxima semana.
next week, as of the 10th of March, there'll be a response and we'll be able to embark on these negotiations.
Y como me queda poco tiempo, quiero decirles
Since I have just very little time left,
que la comunidad internacional está apoyando seriamente nuestro proceso,
I have to tell you that there is strong support from the international community concerning this process.
que confiamos en que pronto vamos a poder firmar la paz y todos vamos a poder hacer algo por nuestro país.
We are confident that we will be able to sign this agreement and we'll be able to do something good for our country.
Que estamos seguros que seremos los guatemaltecos los que sacaremos adelante a nuestro país.
We are convinced that it is us, the Guatemalans, who will be able to take our country forward.
Que la Centroamérica de hace 10 años ha cambiado mucho.
The Central America of 10 years ago has gone through revolutionary changes.
Pero hay algo que debo decir acá en los Estados Unidos.
However, there is something that I must tell you here in the United States.
En los últimos 10 años, a partir de 1980, tuvimos una sobrepresencia militar estadounidense en Centroamérica.
In the last 10 years, starting in 1980, we have had a very strong, too strong a presence, military presence of the U.S. in Guatemala.
Quiero decirles que desde 1980 1978, desde 1978, Guatemala no tiene ayuda militar estadounidense.
Since 1977, Guatemala has not received military aid from the United States.
Pero que la Centroamérica de hace 10 años, cuando estaba Nicaragua con su enfrentamiento armado, Panamá con sus situaciones internas, El Salvador con su situación también difícil y Honduras con una sobrepresencia militar,
But however, when there were armed conflicts in Nicaragua, in Panama, in Honduras, in El Salvador,
esa situación ha cambiado y hoy los centroamericanos confiamos en que pronto llegará la paz a nuestra región.
that situation that existed 10 years ago no longer exists, and therefore there are big changes in the offing.
Que queremos confiar que los hechos del pasado serán una reflexión para nosotros,
We are hoping to reflect on the facts of the past,
que vamos a poder entender los retos y los desafíos del presente
we hope to be able to understand the challenges of today,
y que de esa manera le vamos a poder forjar un mejor futuro a nuestros pueblos y a nuestra región.
and in doing so we'll be able to construct a better future for our country and for our region.
Y lo único que esperamos de los países como Estados Unidos es que nos vean con respeto.
The only thing that we expect from countries such as the United States is to treat us with respect.
Porque somos países pequeños en población y territorio,
We are small countries, both in population and in territory,
pero somos exactamente de la misma estatura en dignidad.
but however, when it comes to stature in dignity terms, we are equal.
Y eso es lo que ha querido el presidente Serrano con los Estados Unidos y con el resto del mundo, tener una amistad sincera y una amistad que sea de colaboración.
This is what President Serrano is trying to achieve with other countries, a relationship of cooperation.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Conde. Mr. Hamilton.
I've been director for the Office of Central American Affairs since last July. This office comprises the 5 countries traditionally considered Central America, plus Belize. And the first 7 months in this job has been very instructive. I have not served in Guatemala. I've been there many times, but I perhaps know other countries in Central America more intimately than I do Guatemala. What I've been struck by in the first 7 or 8 months is the centrality of the human rights issue to our entire relationship. No other issue receives as much attention. We discuss it with everybody in Guatemala. Just within the executive branch of the Guatemalan government, it's never fails to come up when we meet with the president, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Interior Ministry, which has its own human rights office, with the Office of the Attorney General, with the Human Rights Commission that Dr. Neumann heads, and with the Military High Command. At the same time, we have a very close and cooperative relationship with the non-governmental institutions in Guatemala. These include, actually still continuing in the government, the Special Attorney General for Human Rights, the so-called Ombudsman for Human Rights, the Office of the Archbishop of the Catholic Church, which has puts out an annual human rights report. And then there are several very important non-governmental Guatemalan institutions that we stay in very close contact with. Now, I thought what it would be helpful for me to do in my time is to describe several aspects of our human rights policy. Dr. Heyman mentioned the Human Rights Report. This is a public document published at the end of January every year. I read it again on the plane coming up here today. It does note some improvements and changes for the better over the last year in Guatemala, but on the whole, one is struck, setting it down, that it makes for depressing reading. And we all wish that wasn't the case. But our human rights report, we believe, is at the very basis of our approach to promoting human rights, because it does not seek to be a condemnatory document. It simply is the best effort that the United States executive branch is capable of making to let the facts of what has happened during the preceding year speak for themselves. In addition to putting out this report, we pay particular attention to a number of the so-called notorious human rights cases. Dr. Heyman mentioned one. There have been several others, and in one case involving an American citizen, Michael Devine. We've paid particular attention to the trial that has been going on, resulted just 3 weeks ago in a conviction of a military or ex-military personnel in the case of the anthropologist Mir Namak. And we have paid close attention and tried to give support to Sister Diana Ortiz, among others. Dr. Heyman was, of course, involved in our Administration of Justice program. That program has continued. AID also has a so-called Democratic Initiatives program under which we provide financial and technical assistance to the Guatemalan Congress, to the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman, and to the Office of the Attorney General of Guatemala. We're also providing training and forensic equipment to Guatemala's National Police, this being provided through the FBI, the Department of Justice Program for International Criminal Investigative Training and Assistance. The underlying concept of this program is that many human rights abuses flow from the frustration of security and police officials and the inability to get convictions in court. And that is a function of their inability to conduct professional investigations that stand up in court. Now, although we suspended military assistance again in Guatemala in 1990 out of human rights considerations, and we still have a prohibition on the sale of any commercial sales of defense articles to Guatemala, we do have a modest program of training and educational programs with the Guatemalan military. We think that this is important, that it can make a modest contribution. Just the week before last, we completed a course that was especially designed for Guatemala, and we hope to replicate it elsewhere. It was conducted by the U.S. Navy's School of Military Justice. We did it in 3 phases. The first, we sent a team down to Guatemala and consulted extensively with personnel in the Guatemalan military system of justice. We also consulted with people in the academic community and the judicial system itself. We then brought a group of Guatemalans to the United States for several days, more than a week, where they looked at the U.S. systems of justice, military and civilian, and then together designed a course which was just conducted. Reports we got was that this was well received and generated a lot of enthusiasm. 19 military officers, high-ranking officers participated. We had 15 civilians from various academic and judicial professions. Let me move along quickly. Workers' rights is a very important aspect of our human rights policy. This is mandated by law as well as by policy. Under the legislation authorizing the generalized system of preferences, of which Guatemala is a beneficiary, we are legally and politically, morally bound to ensure that workers' rights are protected. There have been petitions the last 2 years presented to withdraw rights from Guatemala. As a result, we have been very actively engaged in a dialogue with the Guatemalan government designed to help them take those steps that would genuinely put them in a position to meet the concerns. And we've been very pleased that just in December, a very thoroughgoing modernization of the Guatemalan Labor Code was adopted. It is going into effect. There's some things to be done including the hiring and financing of labor ministry inspectors to give this new code the substance that's intended for it. But the progress here has actually been very encouraging. Let me mention one other institution that we gave some support to because I think it will put maybe in shed a little bit different perspective on the Guatemalan military as an institution. In 1989, the Guatemalan military founded a center called ESNA, the Center for Strategic Studies for National Stability. And this brings together in a year-long course leaders from every sector of civilian society in Guatemala: indigenous leaders, labor leaders, political parties, business, and it has been, so we gave it funding to help it get through its initial period. It is being continued by the present leadership of the Ministry of Defense, and it has been such a success that we're trying to see if it can be replicated in other Central American countries, and particularly in Honduras and in El Salvador. It has aroused a great deal of enthusiasm on both sides of the aisle in our Congress, where they think that this is precisely the kind of painstaking, incremental approach to promoting human rights and reconciliation in conflictive societies that over the long haul would make sense. I know I'm taking too long, Doctor, but one final observation. Everybody that I know who knows Guatemala well says, plan a policy to promote human rights that will work over the long haul, that you cannot expect changes overnight. It'll come slowly, be prepared to stick to it. And I think this is good advice. And I think that you will see that the kinds of things that I've outlined as constituting our human rights policy will probably not bring about the millennium very quickly. But I'm also impressed by, and the observation has been made here once by you already, and it is the primary point made by the UN's independent human rights expert whose report was just issued in the last several weeks, and it's the primary point of the Catholic Church's human rights report on Guatemala, and it's this, that the majority of human rights violations are a derivative of the conflict, and that if you want to do something dramatic to improve the human rights situation, help bring the conflict to an end. It's in that context, I think, that we have recently been very encouraged that the peace talks, originally launched 2 years ago, but which had not been making a great deal of progress, have been reinvigorated by the presentation of a new proposal by President Serrano. I would agree totally with Mr. Conde that the international community is very much encouraged, believes that this is worth supporting. We like the idea as well of the process setting itself, subjecting itself to the discipline of deadlines. As we look back upon what ultimately was a very successful peace negotiation in El Salvador, I think we realize it took altogether too long. We don't want the Guatemalan talks to take 7 years to succeed. But ultimately, what functioned very well in the Salvadoran process was the discipline that some very real-world deadlines exercised over the process. In the case of Salvador, it was the departure at midnight, literally at midnight, on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1991, of the Secretary General. There were other deadlines, real-world deadlines, presented by changes in the legislature and in the elections. I think the real-world deadline in Guatemala is that there are 3 years remaining in President Serrano's term. If you work yourself back from what has to happen before we go into a presidential campaign in Guatemala, it really imposes the need to reach an agreement this year. There's the experience of implementing an agreement in Salvador shows that you really need to get the implementation phase going a good year to a year and a half before you're in a full-scale electoral campaign. That really imposes the obligation of reaching an agreement this year, and we're hopeful that we can be supportive of a process that has that as its objective.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Professor Shermer, because of the time that everybody's taken so far, you only have 30 seconds.
Thank you. I'd like to offer a few insights that are based on 8 years of research interviewing military officers in Guatemala, 3 heads of state, and other important civilian politicians in that country. And I think I should start by saying that evaluating civil-military relations and the possibilities for full democratization in Guatemala requires, I believe, a rigorous understanding of the thinking of the military itself. We need to listen to officers who are the architects of military policy. And I think forums like this one tonight will help generate a dialogue on its own between military and civilians. Now, we need to understand officers' attitudes about national security, armed and unarmed opposition, human rights, electoral democracy, in order to evaluate to what extent their avowed professionalism allows for full participation, or some form of coexistence at least, and whether the constitutionalizing of those demands is sufficient to guarantee not only a peace process, but basic human rights. Now, whether or not we agree with a military point of view, we should not underestimate their abilities to think through sophisticated policies. So let me just speak to a number of issues briefly as I can, that I think are important to add to this discussion. In the early 1980s, a significant portion of the military elite realized that there was no long-term solution to the insurgency, and that the fragility and exhaustion of the old mano dura militarism in confronting economic and insurgency crises had caused serious cracks in the Army's own institutionality that was on the verge of collapse, as several officers have now admitted. This realization led to significant changes in both military doctrine and strategy, with their National Plan of Security and Development stating that war had to be fought on all fronts, military, political, and above all, socioeconomic. This national plan began with what the military called pacification campaigns of 1982 and ended with National Assembly and presidential elections in 1985. It entailed no less than the reconstruction of the military and intelligence apparatus and plans for an outreach into civil society for allies. This national plan, in turn, grew into the consciously autonomous strategy entitled the Thesis of National Stability, which adapts counterinsurgency to an electoral apertura and inserts the concept of national stability as a first stage towards national security into the very Guatemalan Constitution itself. So the thesis, we should understand, represents a model of constant flexibility for the Guatemalan military to keep a pulse on society it serves. As the thesis itself states, the armed forces have come to constantly accommodate its strategy in response to the political, economic, and social conditions which present themselves as the interests of the nation. It permanently serves as object of revision depending upon the necessities of the moment, always with the intention of maintaining the state and maintaining public order. The U.S. imposed doctrine of national security, which Manuel Conde, I believe, referred to earlier, because of its dogmatism and because it was understood as a doctrine of force in Central America, represents for the Guatemalan military officers a decrepit and intolerable doctrine within the democratic system. Low-intensity conflict may mean low intensity for the U.S., one elite officer told me, but it means high intensity for Guatemalans. The thesis also attempts to create an autonomy from the long-standing ties with the oligarchy. As one officer intoned, we were used by them to fight the counterinsurgency campaigns of the early 1980s, and no one thanked us for it. They used us and then blamed us for every violation. We are no longer concubines. We are no longer redeemers of the old order. This generation of military officers is more professional. We are tired of being the peons of rich businessmen and politicians. This is a very self-conscious, autonomous doctrine, which I believe needs to be understood in order to understand civil-military relations in Guatemala. Now, autonomy from U.S. and oligarchic impositions is paramount in the thesis. But the thesis goes on to read that while the present Constitution is highly tolerant and pluralistic, decisions of government are not enough to maintain national stability. They felt they had to step into the vacuum that had been created and fill in and make sure that security was maintained. And security must materialize by virtue of both civilian and military leadership, publicly seeming to have a common concept of national stability. It materializes through a structured strategic flexibility set forth under the thesis outline entitled Opponents of the Actions of the State, in which conflict is hierarchized in terms of increasing intensity. These include antagonisms, which include strikes, violent demonstrations, and corruption; vulnerabilities, which include corruption, lack of education, external debt, capital flight; pressures, all of the opponents who are backed and supported by another power; and finally, dominant pressures or threats, all those pressures whose power reaches the national level or who represent an unstable situation. This thesis speaks of the need for overcoming or eliminating such conflict at the initial stage before it grows in intensity. I just want to read quickly from one interview that I had with an elite officer saying, "Are you saying that there is effectively no political space when people go on strike in Guatemala? When unionists go on strike because there is repressed anger about wages, it is assumed by the army that this anger is being used by opponents. Can you not distinguish between the two?" And he responded, "It is difficult to distinguish between the two. There's always going to be conflict, but we the Army want is for these conflicts to be within certain parameters, that they don't resort to violence. Public disorder is an opponent of the state. I understand why you as a striker are angry because of low wages, but you are outside the law if the strike interferes with traffic, for example. The thesis recognizes that there will be frictions, but all these forces must come together under the national interest." And I ask, and meanwhile, what happens during this transition? There is conflict within the laws of the Constitution. How does one control this conflict? Well, we are within the laws of the Constitution, but we know, as I say, but we know that there are still people being disappeared and assassinated. And he responds, "Because we have not passed this stage of transition." So I ask, so you are saying that during this stage that such repression is necessary to maintain order, public order? Yes, clearly. I've lost my place here, of course. Yes, clearly. But within this stage of transition, the first thing we did was to provide political spaces for people to strike. And now there are human rights organizations in Guatemala operating, and there are protests and there are strikes. And I add, but at the same time, there are human rights violations. Yes, we do still have abuses. They have diminished, but we do still have violations. But the thesis is what helps us to advance through this. So the key here, according to this officer, is to attack the problem in its infancy so that it doesn't increase. Because once the problem increases, he said, then you must use force. The talent is to visualize the conflict in terms of how bad economic or political measures can develop into more intensive conflict, for that is when it is necessary to use brute force. And within the thesis itself, this doctrine of flexibility is named minimum force. If there is someone who is against the interests of Guatemala, another officer intones, and you appear to stare and glare and nothing more, and the police appear ready to act, then the will to act against the interests of Guatemala quickly evaporates. That way, you see, they cannot say that you are using force. It is coercive force, yes, but force used in a much more sophisticated manner. From this discussion, I think we can understand the irony that repression is perceived as a necessary part of the electoral transition. Human rights sometimes are necessary to sacrifice for the advancement of a secure democracy. To not allow for what I have called innocent dissent, even if you have a legitimate complaint, signifies that the army assumes and feels it must always assume complicity of its citizens in manipulated dissent. Oh, no, I'm really messed up here, aren't I? I'm sorry, excuse me.
dirty trick, Jennifer.
Sorry.
I've removed the last page.
It automatically views nonviolent actions as potentially violent ones. In other words, there doesn't seem, and I will stand corrected by some of the officers here, there does not seem to be any viable right to oppose and dissent without taking the extraordinarily dangerous risk of being categorized and preemptively viewed as delinquent subversive terrorists. Discontent, by definition, is always potentially manipulable into dissent and is assumed to grow in intensity. So that while the thesis sheds some of the dogmatism of national security doctrine, I believe it retains some of the same threat mentality and assumption that conflict is inherently negative and something to be controlled or eliminated. In my mind, the thesis represents a low-profile but powerful form of political crisis management of opponents of what is seen as an ever-vulnerable state within the walls of a constitutional parliamentary regime, and reveals a permanent and selective war on potential opponents who need not have actually acted on anything, but is assumed will act in the future. Now, I think this raises the whole issue of trying to accommodate national security issues to military-initiated transitions to electoral democracy, and I believe may represent a future model for other Latin American strategic thinking. I believe that it documents to date the High Command's belief that a realization of the military project begun in 1982 entails protecting and securitizing an electoral democracy from opponents of the state. Now, while this is certainly a military-initiated transition, I should add that it has and remains a regime of co-governance with very strong impetus towards military-civil relationships. Part of this co-governance is reflected in what John Hamilton has just relayed to you in terms of ESNA, the establishment of the Center of Strategic Studies for National Stability, which was decreed by President Cerezo in 1989. And these are forums provided to civilians and officers to discuss the future role of the military, among other things. It's an attempt to institutionalize civil-military relations in for particular sectors of Guatemalan society. But I should also add that not everyone is invited to these forums. So we have to make clear as to the particular sectors who are. As one civilian told me who works closely with ESNA, we are trying to rid ourselves of the hyphen between civilian and military in co-governing Guatemala. Now, one last question. What has been the role of civilian presidents and politicians in this matrix of co-governance? Are these collaborative regimes? I can only speak with regard to the Cerezo regime and say that according to his own admissions, he was given far more access to Army intelligence files than has previously been thought, raising two questions in my mind. One, the possibility in the future of civilian oversight of military intelligence, and two, the issue of at what point does compromise become complicity. So these are issues that I think need to be addressed when we are dealing with civil-military relations in Guatemala. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shermer. Ms. Manuel of America's Watch.
Thank you. I've been looking enviously at Jennifer's nicely typed notes.
I couldn't
and
find
I just
them.
hope that I can actually decipher mine. We'll all be better off if I can. America's Watch is a division of Human Rights Watch, which has been monitoring human rights in Guatemala since 1982. And I wanted to start out just by stepping back a little bit and talking about some of the positive developments that have occurred and that we really acknowledge have occurred in Guatemala over the last 5 years or so. I mean, there is really no question that Guatemala is a different country from 1982 or 1978 or even 1984. We welcome civilian government, we welcome elections, the transition from, peaceful transition from one civilian government to another. We welcome a number of the institutional developments that have been very important in human rights, such as probably the most important thing has been the development of a human rights ombudsman and various auxiliaries in all of the departments of Guatemala. This is the beginning of a capacity to monitor human rights violations really systematically throughout the country, which has not existed and can be very helpful in reducing abuses. And in fact, I think that the work that the Ombudsman has done so far is a major contribution to the relatively lower level of abuses than there were in the early 80s. Even now, for example, where a group of about 2,500 refugees repatriated from Mexico are moving into an area in the northern Quiché, the Ombudsman has a representative there. When something happens, they are there, they can investigate the incident. This is really extremely promising and has already been a very positive development. We also welcome the naming of Bernardo Neumann to a very high-level commission, executive commission, which deals with human rights issues, which acts something as a liaison with human rights groups, helping us gain access to officials in the military and in the civilian part of the government. All of this is important. And I should also mention that President Serrano came into office making very strong promises on human rights, and particularly on the issue of impunity. And he appointed an Attorney General, Cisco Valladares, who really made an energetic effort to press charges in cases of human rights violations. We're sorry to see Valladares go, but we are happy that he was able to achieve some results in some cases. The recent conviction of a former sergeant major in the Estado Mayor Presidencial for the murder of Myrna Mack is, he made an important contribution to that coming about, which John Hamilton had referred to. Having said those, important developments that have happened in the last 5 or 6 years, overall, I have to say that America's Watch is very discouraged about the human rights situation in Guatemala, about the ways that it hasn't changed, about the fact that although many human rights groups now operate in Guatemala, they go to work every day not knowing if they'll come home alive. It's one of the more dangerous places to be a human rights monitor in the world, really. There have been several fundamental areas where there has been no change or not enough change. Basically, those are extrajudicial executions, disappearances, torture, arbitrary detentions by the army, the police, and the civil patrols. There are really no adequate statistics to measure the level of this on a national scale, but they continue to go on at a very disturbingly high level, certainly lower than it was in the early 80s, but they continue to be at a significant level. And what helps this pattern continue is the fact that the violators routinely are not identified, are not prosecuted, and are not punished in any way. There has never been anyone held responsible for a disappearance in Guatemala, in spite of the fact that the UN Working Group on Disappearances has more than 2,400 reports of disappearances which have gone uninvestigated. There has never been a prosecution of anyone for torture or for ill treatment of a detainee in Guatemala, unless someone please correct me if there's a case I've overlooked. There have been some occasions in the last few years in which members of the military or police have been brought to justice for assassinations, and that is important. We hope to see it be more than just token. But perhaps just to sort of sum up a very quick summary, I think the most disturbing continuing element for us, and this is also mentioned in many of the reports that Phil Hyman made reference to, including the report of the UN independent expert, is the almost knee-jerk reaction on the part of high military and government officials to human rights criticism to attack those who expose the abuses. This year has seen, for example, the threat to prosecute the anthropologist Clyde Snow, who has been making a very important contribution to the search for accountability in Guatemala by assisting in the exhumation of clandestine cemeteries, of which there are many in the Guatemalan highlands. He has trained a group of forensic anthropologists who, acting under judicial order, exhume these skeletons, and through very sophisticated scientific methods identify the victims, and they can determine the cause of death. Some remarks that Clyde Snow made about military abuses brought a threat that he should be prosecuted. Similarly, when a group of Guatemalan human rights activists came to Washington a few months ago for a conference on the theme of torture in Guatemala, the response was that they were obviously doing the work of the guerrillas. There was even some discussion of prosecutions there. When the Archbishop's Human Rights Office assisted a woman named Maritza Urrutia, who had been kidnapped and had been released, and they gave her protection. They were later accused of covering up a crime because they had not, during the time when she was still in their office and before she was able to flee the country, they had not come forward with her story, basically to protect her life. Basically, I think there is no human rights group in Guatemala which has not felt this kind of stinging criticism coming from the highest levels of the government and the military. And as the independent expert pointed out in his report, this really isn't an appropriate subject for the military to be giving its opinions on in a democracy. It's not only that the military seems to be opining on something which is a matter that should be taken to the courts if in fact there is some evidence of some criminal action, but that in Guatemala this can have a tremendous effect of intimidation. Guatemala is a country where 25 human rights activists have been murdered or disappeared in only the last 6 years. So to make these kind of statements not only puts the people who are the most committed to human rights in Guatemala at grave danger, but it also, to the outside world, it raises questions about the sincerity of the government's statements that it supports human rights. It does not help the public relations of the government when they make these kind of attacks. They do not have a lot of credibility outside the country. And so this is really one of the areas where we see that the Guatemalan military establishment and senior officials could easily change this behavior, and it would win them a tremendous amount of goodwill in the international community if they would have not view everyone who does human rights work and reports critically on their behavior as a member of the guerrillas.
Thank you very much. At this point, we would like to go to the floor for questions. I'd like to urge people who want to ask questions to go to one of the microphones at the two sides, and I'll ask you to identify yourself if you will. You can direct your question to one of the panel or to the entire panel for anyone who wants to answer it as you please. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Mr. Hamilton. My name is Lee Valentine. El Señor Conde has expressed something that I think is the opinion of lots of Latin American leaders, and that is they want to be seen on equal footing with the United States in any form of diplomatic negotiations. I've been concerned, and perhaps you can clear up this concern, that Dr. Hyman mentioned the United Nations, and you've mentioned unilateral approaches. Has any attempt been made to work with the OAS and get a consensus through the OAS? If not, why not? And what is the OAS's opinion on this? Why are we working with UN working groups? and not pursuing this through a regional office.
Pursuing what? The human rights
The
question or the
yes,
peace process?
The question of human rights and the peace process. Why are they both going through the UN rather than the OAS? Why are we taking this from a larger point of view rather than a regional?
Well, actually, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I think, has been active in Guatemala, and you can probably know that better than I. But the reason that the UN is involved in the peace process was because that's what the Guatemalans asked. And they did so at a time that the Salvadoran talks looked very promising, and that had been done with UN mediation. I think one of the reasons that they did was because the UN at that time was headed by a Latin American, a very able Latin American diplomat, Pérez de Cuellar. And the people who were conducting the mediation effort were all Latin Americans. But it's still a fair question as to why the OAS is not more involved. Certainly the OAS has gotten very much involved in other mediation efforts. It is very actively engaged in the effort we have underway in Haiti. It played a very crucial role in providing an international presence to help reintegrate the Nicaraguan members of the Nicaraguan resistance following elections there. The OAS really is become quite a dynamic and I think very helpful institution that's become much more assertive and is making its presence felt in a way that it hadn't for many years. But I think the reason, at least as concerns the Guatemalan peace process, is the one I would give you. But maybe
Mr. Neumann wanted to say something on that too, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Neumann, if you'll recall, is the head of the Guatemalan President's Commission on Human Rights.
Yes, answering your question, Guatemala has ratified all the conventions related to the OAS. For example, we have recognized the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, Court, and also the jurisdiction of the Human Rights Commission. In fact, just last Saturday morning, I presented some of our reports to the Commission. In fact, I would like to point out that Guatemala is one of the few countries in the continent that have recognized the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Human Rights Court. For example, the United States has not. And we have, therefore, handled most of our cases through the OAS. It is a vehicle also for members for citizens who would like to file a complaint. Through the American Convention, they can accede to the Human Rights Commission and be heard, and the government must attend to it and answer it. And if the case is of such nature that it needs to go to court, the cases have been brought to the Inter-American Court, and the government has been present to defend its position or explain its position.
Thank you. Mr. Conde, and then I do have to, our panel is so enthusiastic about answering, I have to be careful because there are lots of people waiting with questions. Mr. Conde?
Gracias. Entiendo que su duda es sobre la participación de Naciones Unidas en el proceso de paz guatemalteco.
Your doubt concerns the participation of the OAS in the peace process?
No, of the UN.
¿Naciones Unidas? Bueno, solamente quería decirle que entre el proceso de paz salvadoreño y el proceso de paz guatemalteco hay diferencias sustanciales y el papel de Naciones Unidas en el proceso guatemalteco es únicamente como observador del proceso y no como mediador.
The UN's role in the Guatemalan peace process is only as an observer, not as a mediator.
Is only,
Observer, not a mediator.
yes, sir.
My name is Dale Johnson, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School of Government. And I'm interested in the role of the indigenous population in that peace process. There's a lot of talk tonight about how the military is controlling the process, and I'd like to know from our Guatemalan delegation what they feel is needed to demilitarize the political process and to bring the indigenous rights to an equivalency with the rights of the Hispanic population in Guatemala.
I'm going to wait just for a minute for the question to be translated, and then any of you may answer. General Garcia, should we give you a turn? Yes, sir. General Garcia.
En primer lugar, el proceso de paz no corresponde a un hecho militarizado.
The peace process doesn't necessarily correlate to a militarized process, to a process that has a military character to it.
En diferentes instancias previos a la negociación en México, hubo otras instancias en donde tuvo la participación todos los sectores del país, incluyendo las etnias guatemaltecas.
Prior to the beginning of the negotiations in Mexico, there was participation by everybody,
Etnias,
including the ethnic
groups.
the
tal
ethnic
manera
groups.
que el ejército participa porque fue uno de los primeros que sacó a la mesa de negociación llegar a una paz desde la década de los años 1970.
It was the military, in fact, the one who brought that forth into the agenda since the 70s.
En la década de los 80 volvió a plantear también un acuerdo para que se llegara a la paz, y no fue sino hasta después en los procesos de Esquipulas e insertos nuevamente dentro de la negociación actual de Oslo hasta México,
And it wasn't until more recently, between the Oslo negotiations and until the Mexico negotiations,
en donde participamos en la Comisión de Gobierno, apoyando las decisiones del señor Presidente de la República y el anhelo del pueblo.
it was
de
only
Guatemala.
until then that the military started participating in the negotiations, and only to strengthen the position of the president.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Christina Ewig. I'm a member of the Cambridge community, and I have a question for Mr. Hamilton. And this regards U.S. involvement in Central America, and that's that the U.S. has played a very negative role throughout Central America historically in terms of military intervention and economic intervention. And my question is twofold regarding the U.S. involvement in the Guatemala peace process. And first being why the U.S. did not take a more positive stand in terms of forcing the issue for the Guatemalan government to take a more positive role towards human rights. In that we have such a strong position within Central America, we certainly could have taken economic measures against the Guatemalan government and forcing them to have a better human rights record much earlier. And now that we are at the table in terms of peace negotiations, what kind of role will the U.S. take in terms of ensuring that we will, to the best of our ability, make sure that these peace negotiations come out most positively?
Well, I don't mean to be dismissive of the first question you raised, but it invites a very long answer or a very short one. My own presentation is designed to try to explain the sorts of things that we're doing that we think will be constructive and over the long haul and sustained, that can make a difference. And one could wish that we had gotten on it, started on it sooner. and we might differ as to when we really did, but and we might differ as to how we would characterize the totality of our involvement and the difference that it's made in what has happened in Central America. But let me pass on to the second part of your question. We are not a part of these talks, but we're not present physically when they take place. But both sides are interested in talking to us, and just recently, actually, the government has invited us to join a group of 4 countries that are going to play a role in the process that still has to be defined, but which is beginning to take shape now. Those countries being Spain, Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia. Now, one of the things that we're doing, I would say, differently than we did at a similar stage of the peace talks in El Salvador is that we're talking to the guerrillas. We did not do that in the Salvador talks until the very end. They wanted that contact, and we held it out as an incentive for more flexibility in the talks themselves. The Guatemalan government has encouraged us actually to talk to the guerrillas, and we're doing that, and we hope that it'll be positive. But it's ultimately going to be the responsibility, of the Guatemalans themselves to make an agreement. I do think that the process of talks, and the more the talks are intensified, creates a dynamic that is in and of itself very important, because it basically is, and this gets to the point that Dr. Heyman raised at the outset. What you need to do is really create confidence on the guerrilla side that they can return under an agreement, and with confidence that they can take up civilian pursuits in safety. And the negotiation process itself is very important in generating that. And we believe that we can be helpful simply by talking to both sides, and that's one of the things we're doing.
Yes, sir.
My name is Dan Newman. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. Mr. Conde mentioned the need for greater equity in the distribution of economic resources as a requirement for a peace process to go forward. My question is there any evidence that this is in fact taking place?
Bueno, hemos entrado en estos 2 años de gobierno
We have just started in the last 2 years
a un esfuerzo de una modernización tributaria
in an effort to reform our tax code
que nos ha permitido llevar servicios y llevar bienestar a la gran comunidad que no había tenido acceso a esos bienes y servicios.
that has allowed us to bring goods and services to large parts of the community that did not have access to them before.
Quiero mencionarle 2 ejemplos muy importantes.
I'll give you 2 examples.
Uno es el Fondo para la Paz,
The Fund for Peace,
que es destinado a favorecer a todas aquellas poblaciones más afectadas por el enfrentamiento armado.
has as its objective to benefit those people who are most affected by the armed conflict.
Y otro de ellos es el llamado Fondo Indígena,
And the other one is the Indigenous Fund,
que es destinado a llevar a aquellas comunidades indígenas los recursos que les permitan desarrollarse en libertad y respetando sus identidades.
that is intended to bring resources to those indigenous people to allow them to develop.
Y esto es muy importante mencionarlo porque en nuestro país tenemos 23 etnias diferentes,
This is particularly important in our country because there are 20 different indigenous groups.
pero por encima de las 23 etnias está el sentimiento de que todos somos guatemaltecos.
But beyond that number, it is the feeling that we're all Guatemalans.
Y el gobierno del presidente Serrano trabaja decididamente para crear esa mejoría de condiciones en toda la sociedad guatemalteca.
And the regime of President Serrano is committed to improve the conditions throughout Guatemala.
Y hasta este momento los dos fondos han sido asistidos con recursos propios de los guatemaltecos.
And these two funds have been fully supported by internal funds of Guatemala.
I want to call on General Garcia, but I would just like to ask a question. Mr. Conde, when I was there, Guatemala had the lowest tax rate in the hemisphere, northern and southern hemisphere, and there was indeed a coup attempt when President Cerezo tried to raise that tax. It was something like 7 or 8% was the highest rate anybody was paying on income. Has there been an increase in tax since then?
Bueno, quiero decirle que entre el gobierno del presidente Cerezo y el gobierno del presidente Serrano ha habido muchísima diferencia.
There are significant differences between the regime of President Cerezo and President.
Y ha sido precisamente esa recaudación más efectiva que hemos tenido la que nos ha permitido hacer cambios muy importantes.
And we have been able to collect funds more effectively than before.
Y yo
That has allowed us to implement some changes.
Y quiero mencionar uno que a usted le va a agradar mucho escuchar.
And I will mention one that you will be happy to hear about.
El gobierno ha incrementado 4 veces más el presupuesto para la Corte Suprema de Justicia.
The Supreme Court of Justice has seen its budget increase fourfold.
Y ahora están abriéndose juzgados en todos los municipios del país.
And trial houses, courthouses are being opened everywhere in the country.
Y estamos por tener en vigencia un nuevo código penal que establece el juicio oral.
We expect to very soon implement a new penal code.
Y hay programas.
Un juicio oral.
Juicio oral.
An oral type of, verbal type of trial.
Y estamos implementando juzgados con jueces bilingües en las comunidades indígenas.
And we have begun implementing a system of bilingual judgeships in indigenous communities.
Y muchas otras cosas se hacen en las áreas de educación y de salud.
Several other things are happening in the arenas of health and education.
Los presupuestos, para citarle el caso de educación, el Ministerio de Educación tenía al año 250 millones de quetzales.
In the case of the Education Ministry, its budget was
250 millones.
250 million quetzales.
Ahora, en este año, el Ministerio de Educación tiene 1.300 millones de quetzales.
This year, the figure rose to 1.3 billion quetzales.
Esos son algunos ejemplos que se han logrado.
That's just a few examples.
General Garcia.
Voy a agregar algo respecto a la pregunta que hicieran, en el sentido de que por 30 años de lucha que hemos llevado,
in 30 years of armed struggle,
en defensa de lo que corresponde al Estado guatemalteco y a la propiedad de los guatemaltecos,
in the defense of the Guatemalan state and the Guatemalan property,
se ha detenido el desarrollo económico y social por la acción de la insurgencia.
The economic and social development has been halted due to the armed conflict,
especialmente por las acciones terroristas que últimamente han llevado a cabo y en el proceso de los 30 años.
And especially as a consequence of the terrorist actions that have taken place the last 30 years.
En volar puentes, destruir puentes,
detonate bridges,
destruir torres de conducción de energía eléctrica,
networks of electricity,
derramar grandes cantidades de petróleo,
spill large quantities
y
of
por
oil.
lo tanto el desarrollo en educación, en salud y en la infraestructura vial no puede llegar a las comunidades más necesitadas.
And therefore, many communities who are very much in need of these services, development to those communities has been halted, has been severely impaired.
Sin embargo, el esfuerzo se hace de todas maneras en ese sentido para quitar cualquier estructura que se quiera utilizar en que por la consecuencia de los atrasos económicos y sociales exista una lucha que en ese sentido ahora no tiene cabida.
¿Puede repetir la idea central del último pensamiento?
Que para evitar que por esos atrasos económicos y sociales se mantenga todavía un conflicto que no tiene sentido en este momento.
Nonetheless, we continue to struggle to bring about services and development to those communities because we realize that that is one of the reasons that the armed conflict exists to begin with. Would
Oh,
you
it was
want,
not correctly translated. Go-
Mr. Neumann, would you like to explain it better?
As General Garcia said that the difficulties in having these social and economic progress applied was due to this confrontation. But that's the reason that this confrontation has no reason to be. It is totally irrational, and it must end. That's what General Garcia said.
Here's what the State Department report said about poverty in Guatemala. It says minimum wages are set by law due to a variety of factors, most importantly the sharp variance between the oversupply of labor and the very limited demand for it. The minimum wage becomes the prevailing wage ceiling and not the more commonly accepted wage floor for most unskilled and semi-skilled workers. Widespread credible reports indicate the minimum wage is commonly, if illegally, not paid to significant numbers of rural and urban workers. The current minimum wage does not provide a decent standard of living. Government statistics indicate that an estimated 80% of the population lives below the Guatemalan poverty line, including approximately 70% of those employed. Of course, Mr. Neumann would like to respond to that, and that deserves a response. Go ahead.
Yes, when we started in our present administration 2 years ago, we found that situation to be the truth. 83% has lived under the poverty line. To take over a country in those conditions is sometimes beyond comprehension how to solve it. But what Professor Hyman read from the State Department report has already since been acted on. And for example, we mentioned that just previously that the first change in the labor code in 40 some years happened during this semester. And we mentioned also that the modernization of the tax system has changed the situations. We have also mentioned that as this administration goes forward, we are restructuring the system, restructuring the governmental system, because we had found a country ungovernable. And that is something that must be taken into account. And added to that, the confrontation and the terrorist actions that prevented so many plans to take effect.
Now, I have let the situation run completely out of control. We have 7 people standing, waiting for questions. Heather is threatening me with some form of violence. What I suggest we do is, if you will, let's see how fast we can go. Let's ask the questions as quickly as you can. We'll try to keep the answers short up here. I apologize for not having kept us closer to schedule.
My name is Sarah Sidman, and I'm an undergraduate at Harvard. And to save time, I'll ask it in Spanish. Mi pregunta es, como ustedes estaban hablando en términos de modos democráticos, y yo quiero saber cómo definen ustedes el papel de la participación de los indígenas en la forma de democracia de hoy, y cómo piensa usted que va a cambiar esa participación y el papel de los indígenas en la democracia después del cumplimiento de paz.
This is a good opportunity to thank our translator, Mr. Friedman. Mr. Friedman, will you give it to us in English?
I wasn't even listening. I was relaxing.
Mr. Neumann, will you give it to us in
better
English?
I also speak English.
Oh, that's a brilliant idea.
It's funny,
That's a very good
they
idea.
speak that here. What I was asking is, Mr. Conde was speaking in terms of democracy and democratic modes of participation, and I asked him how he, the government, and the military view the participation of the indigenous population in the democratic forms of today, and how he thinks that will change in the democracy after the peace process has been completed.
I would ask the panelists to be as brief as you can, just giving, as long as you can get the answer, Mr. Conde.
Bueno, en primer lugar, mencionar que en nuestro Congreso de la República tenemos una comisión de asuntos indígenas o de nuestras etnias, en donde tenemos más de 20 diputados indígenas de 116 que tiene nuestro Congreso.
We have to point out that there are a number of commissions that deal with indigenous affairs in our Congress.
Otro dato importante es que la mayor parte de nuestros alcaldes en cada municipio son puramente indígenas.
A large majority of our mayors in our municipalities are of indigenous extraction.
Difícilmente exista en Guatemala una persona que pueda decir que no lleva en sus venas sangre indígena.
It's difficult to find somebody in Guatemala that doesn't carry Indian blood in his veins.
Y nuestro antecedente maya es uno de los tesoros más valiosos para nosotros.
And our Mayan history is one of the things that we treasure the most.
Y yo podría decirle que más que la participación de los indígenas en el proceso democrático,
More than the participation of the indigenous people itself in the democratic process,
tenemos que fortalecer las instancias democráticas de participación.
we have to strengthen the structures of democratic participation.
Tenemos que fomentar el diálogo
We have to motivate the dialogue
y fomentar el debate nacional de todos los sectores.
and motivate the national debate between all the sectors of society.
Mr. Millet, could you just, Mr. Millet, Ambassador Millet, about 50% of the population is indigenous in Guatemala. What percent of the legislature is indigenous?
Well, I'm afraid that in the past legislature, 1986, 1991, we had out of 100 members of Congress, 7 were indigenous. And in this legislature, out of 116, only 5.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Mr. Hamilton. I'm curious, this being the post-Cold War era, what are the organizing philosophical principles that the State Department takes in approaching these sort of situations, and more, presuming that before it was, say, a balance of human rights and global strategic considerations, what are the organizing principles now for deciding whether or not to maintain normal diplomatic relations with whatever government comes into power following elections? Specifically, does it seem the U.S. would have no problem supporting any kind of, presuming the human rights perspective of a newly elected government was good? Would the U.S. maintain normal diplomatic relations with, say, a very anti-trade regime? Is trade the new other side of the U.S. philosophy to these sort of things? What are your perspectives on that?
You mean with a very protectionist regime?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, yes, we would, of course, I think we would have normal diplomatic relations. We would obviously have our trade differences, given that the impetus under the Bush administration, and I think it's going to be continued in the Clinton administration, will be to push for free trade, and particularly in this hemisphere. Democracy and human rights is really the basis for a new bipartisanship in American foreign policy toward the developing world in particular. And I would identify those as the organizing principles.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for being so brief.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll try to be brief also. My question concerns international law and is prompted by the map which shows Belize as part of Guatemala and is directed to the representative of the Bush State Department. Was there any ambivalence in the State Department about going to war to preserve the sovereignty of Kuwait while providing military economic assistance to Guatemala? I'd welcome comments by the representatives of the government of Guatemala too. And if they see military action to take over Belize, or what do they see the future of Belize?
Well, given as much as the government of Guatemala represented here has extended diplomatic relations to the government of Belize and just had its interior minister there for Central American Conference on narcotics, no, we had no such compunctions about our actions in Kuwait.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Doug McCabe. I represent Peace Brigades International. We do the work of nonviolent human accompaniment within Guatemala. I'm wondering if the defense minister could comment on what he sees as the role of international accompaniment as far as safeguarding the human rights of Guatemalans working nonviolently for social change.
I didn't get the word after of international, what was the next word?
Accompaniment.
Accompaniment. It was accompaniment.
He tenido mucha oportunidad de platicar muy seguido con las unidades que ustedes tienen de las compañías de paz.
I have had several chances to establish a dialogue with people like yourself.
Y constantemente mantenemos una comunicación.
And we have an open line of dialogue with you.
Desde que existen hasta la fecha, no tengo conocimiento que hayan tenido ningún problema. Apreciamos mucho el trabajo que hacen en beneficio de la paz.
Since your organization was founded and until now, we have established this dialogue and we are very appreciative of the work you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madam.
I think we've talked about two actors that are very important in the peace process, the military and the government, but I think in Guatemala there's a third actor that we touched upon that wasn't really mentioned, that is the private sector. Traditionally, the private sector has a strong relationship with the military in Guatemala, and the military has acted to maintain control and stability in part in benefit of the private sector. Some of the problems with trade unions, for example, closely touch on attitudes in the private sector. To what extent do you think that the private sector has changed their attitude about human rights in Guatemala, and what do you think the military can do to encourage continuing changing attitudes among the private sector, or that the military counts on support from the private sector?
You get a choice of Mr. Neumann or General Garcia.
Whoever would prefer to answer.
Mr. Neumann, you want to start? Or General Garcia?
Existe un concepto de no diferenciar criterios de quién es Guatemala. Todos somos Guatemala. El ejército es parte de Guatemala, la iniciativa privada es parte de Guatemala.
We're trying not to discriminate between different sectors of society and see all of us as different parts of the Guatemalan society.
Y en este momento no hay ninguna influencia que obligue a la institución armada a tener o adoptar un partido de apoyo, especialmente con el poder económico.
There really isn't anything that could make that points to the direction of the military in Guatemala taking sides with any sector of society.
El compromiso del ejército es asegurar el concepto de Estado y de asegurar también la conciencia del pueblo en una situación puramente democrática. Y ese es nuestro compromiso y eso es lo que vamos a cumplir.
The duty of the Guatemalan military is to maintain the democratic institutions and private property.
We have two more questions.
My name is Heather Wiley. I'm a representative of Amnesty International. General Garcia, I was wondering if you could make some reference and elaborate on statements that you made in early November in which you stated there is no torture in Guatemala. This appeared, I believe, in the 3 Guatemalan dailies and was accompanied by your statements suggesting that those people who participated in a torture conference that was held in Washington, D.C. were participating in acts of subversion against the democratically elected government of Guatemala.
Espero que me puedan interpretar bien y expresar. Yo no acusé a nadie de pertenecer a la guerrilla con respecto a ese tipo de
Yo
declaraciones.
no dije la guerrilla.
No.
Sí, pero mi pregunta no fue así.
Subversivos, perdón, lo mismo.
Semantics. Perdón, please continue. I'm sorry, I will interrupt.
No, yo defiendo la situación en el sentido de que, vuelvo a decirle, no he acusado a nadie, ni voy a acusar a nadie en ese sentido.
I'm not here to blame anybody, and I'm not going to point fingers in any direction.
La posición que yo he adoptado es de que se hable con justicia y con objetividad.
My view is that we should speak based on justice and fairness, objectivity.
Yo considero los derechos humanos como un concepto divino universal que corresponde a todos los humanos.
I consider the concept of human rights as a divine concept that should be applied to all humans.
Y no como un concepto de lucha política, ni ideológica, ni de presión.
And not in political terms, repression terms.
Y esto es a lo que tenemos que aprender todos.
And we all have to learn this lesson.
Y por lo tanto, han habido casos reales de violación a derechos humanos, y si ha sido por las Fuerzas Armadas o por el Ejército, han sido puestos a disposición de la justicia. Pero el Ejército definitivamente ni está inmerso dentro de este problema claramente como institución, y cuando existe individualidad en los hechos, están los tribunales de justicia para
There have been
proceder.
some specific cases where people have been brought to trial when crimes have been committed. However, the armed institution as a whole is not involved in wholesale human rights violations.
Y hechos concretos de torturas en este caso, si han sido evidentemente denunciados, pueden ser aclarados en los tribunales de justicia.
If there is proper evidence pointing to the fact that torture has existed, there is a justice establishment that can take care of it.
Thank you.
I would like to quote from the State Department report on this occasion, going the other direction. The State Department says that the Archbishop's Human Rights Office stated publicly that it did not document any cases of torture in 1992. The State Department goes on to say, nevertheless, as in past years, many bodies were found throughout Guatemala bearing signs of severe disfigurement or post-mortem mutilation. There were credible reports of torture and mistreatment by security forces, including use of excessive force by police at the time of arrest. Yes, ma'am. This is our last question.
Regina Gavin from Needham, and also a member of the Guatemala Committee of CASA in Cambridge, Central American Solidarity Association. I guess you'll have to thank Heather for stealing part of my question. My question, the answer would be directed either to General Garcia or Mr. Conde. And at this conference that a number of us have been mentioning, the Catholic Church was criticized for sending personnel to that conference in November, and I saw this in the press. I think that Mr. Garcia, General Garcia, you were quoted in the Guatemalan press, and that there was a meeting subsequently held between President Serrano and the Archbishop Reinados. My question is, along with what Mr. Conde, you had mentioned that your Mayan history is one of the things that Guatemalans treasure most. Do you have any comment on the role of the Guatemalan Catholic Church in the peace process, and any comments on their pastoral issued in August, 500 Years of Evangelization, where they apologized publicly for the complicit oppression on the part of the Catholic Church and the indigenous population, the history in Guatemala?
Okay. Was that addressed to someone in particular, or?
I assume I can only have one person answer. I'd like both Mr. Conde and General Garcia, but if I can have one, whoever.
Mr. Conde?
Para referirme al proceso de paz estrictamente,
I want to refer strictly to the peace process.
quien conduce el proceso de negociaciones de paz es el conciliador, el obispo Quesada Toruño.
The person who is guiding the peace negotiation is Arzobispo Quesada Toruño.
Es un guatemalteco con suficiente credibilidad y autoridad sobre las dos partes.
He is a Guatemalan that has enough credibility and authority over both sides of the issue.
O sea que el papel que la Iglesia juega en el proceso de paz es un papel muy importante.
The role that the church is playing in the negotiation is a central role.
Y la Iglesia está participando en otras actividades de orden social de una manera muy significativa.
And also, in a very significant way, the church is participating in many other social endeavors.
Pero, como bien se decía por alguna persona antes,
Somebody else before said,
todos los sectores de la sociedad guatemalteca estamos participando en el proceso de paz.
that all sectors of the Guatemalan society are participating in the peace process.
Este es el momento de la reconciliación.
It is time for reconciliation.
Y por eso el gobierno no ha estado de acuerdo en aquellas motivaciones para escarbar heridas del pasado.
And that's why the government is not interested in digging out hurt from the past.
Creemos que la confrontación debe terminar
Confrontation must come to an end,
y no vamos a estar de acuerdo con quien nos llame a la confrontación
and we are not going to agree with whoever is trying to lure us into confrontation,
así sea religioso,
be it religious,
indígena
indigenous,
o político.
or political.
Considero que la Iglesia Católica, yo soy cristiano,
I'm a Christian, and my opinion is that the Catholic Church
debe tomar la dimensión del Evangelio, de propiciar la paz, de no confrontar, sino reconciliar.
must take the evangelical view of try to reconcile, not bring into confrontation.
Y este es el papel que precisamente juega en un momento dado cuando se entiende
And this is the role that it in fact plays when it understands
que la paz es un concepto universal también y un derecho que todos los humanos estamos urgidos de tener.
that peace is a universal concept and we're all entitled to.
Y cualquier sector, cualquier concepto religioso que quiera estructurar dentro de ese camino su cooperación en ese sentido, pues bienvenido. Nosotros estamos claramente identificados en que es urgente que llegue la paz a nuestro país.
Any religious institution or activity that is defined within those bounds is welcome to participate in the peace process.
General Garcia, perhaps I could have the honor of just one last question. Does the Army have any objection to the Archbishop's Human Rights Office and its operations?
Bueno, creo que me da la oportunidad para incluso cerrar un poco con mi intervención algunos aspectos que quiero aclarar.
This gives me the opportunity to clarify a few aspects.
No hay ninguna oposición respecto a la posición de los derechos humanos del arzobispado.
We are not in opposition with the position that the Archbishop has taken.
En un concepto muy personal, siempre que sean objetivos y no que distorsionen la realidad.
My personal view is that as long as they are objective and they're not distorting reality.
El Ejército de Guatemala es la institución que ha mantenido la defensa de lo que corresponde a la nación.
The Guatemalan institution has had as its role to defend what is rightly the Guatemalan nation.
El ministro de la Defensa y el Ejército no son el poder.
They are not the power.
Las declaraciones del ministro no son antes del presidente.
The declarations of the Minister of Defense do not come before the declarations of the President.
Sino corresponden a una adecuada política en respuesta a lo que el presidente nos ha facultado para decir.
And they are in keeping with the policy that the government has laid out for us.
Tampoco tenemos criterios para tener violencia en las operaciones militares.
And we don't have the liberty of action to impose a certain degree of violence in military operations.
No se puede tener una sociedad que está propiciando asegurar la democracia y un Estado de Derecho cuando todavía hay un ataque sistemático de información ideológico y armado contra el Estado de Guatemala.
It is very difficult to maintain an atmosphere of democratic growth when there's an atmosphere of confrontation.
Hemos comprendido a tal grado la profundidad del respeto a los derechos humanos que hemos recogido al enemigo herido en combate, los insurgentes.
We so respect human rights that we have in fact picked up wounded people on the opposing camp.
Les hemos dado los primeros auxilios.
We have given them first aids.
Los hemos llevado a nuestro propio hospital militar.
Taken them to our own hospitals.
Los hemos recuperado y les hemos entregado a las organizaciones de los derechos humanos.
We have seen them recover their health and we have delivered them to the associations of human rights.
Esto puede ser exactamente la presentación de qué es el concepto que hoy sentimos y vivimos los militares.
That can best illustrate the concept under which we military people live.
Podemos perdonar, podemos reconciliarnos. El ataque no ha sido contra el ejército, sino contra un sistema que corresponde a una nación.
We can reach peace and we can reach reconciliation. We understand the attack as not having been on the military establishment, but on the nation as a whole.
Hacemos esfuerzos para que a todos los niveles de la institución armada del ejército se desarrollen cursos sobre derechos humanos.
We are making efforts to make sure that human rights courses are taught throughout the military.
Incluso hemos llevado foros de nivel regional desarrollados en Guatemala.
In fact, we have carried out forums on human rights based on materials created in Guatemala.
Tenemos un constante contacto con el Instituto Interamericano de Derechos Humanos con sede en Costa Rica.
We have a constant route of communication with the Instituto
Interamericano de Derechos Humanos
the Inter-American Human Rights Commission
en Costa Rica.
Based in Costa Rica.
Y por supuesto, estamos preparando a la institución armada para tomar el rol que le corresponda cuando llegue la paz y afianzarnos dentro del Estado de Derecho y nuestro sistema democrático.
And we are trying to prepare the military for the time when peace arrives and its rightful place will be occupied.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel, particularly our Guatemalan guests, Mr. Conde, General Garcia, Mr. Neumann, also you, Mr. Hamilton, Professor Shermer, my friend Ann Manuel, and thank you, audience, for letting me keep you for an extra half hour. Good night.
Haven't gotten